Good morning and welcome to Port Hudson. My name is Michael Frering and I'm going to give a brief history on the Louisiana Native Guard. Now, when the Civil War started in April of 1861, the governor of the state of Louisiana, a man by the name of Thomas More, issued a proclamation that all able-bodied men had to join the state militia to defend the state against foreign invaders. Now, the interesting thing about that statement is this, that when the governor issued this proclamation, he did not specify a race. He said all able-bodied men had to join the state, all free able-bodied men had to join the state militia to defend the state from foreign invaders. He did not say white or black. Louisiana was unique in that it had a fairly large, what they called in those days, a free population of free men of color. Now, these free men of color thought they were obligated to join the state militia to defend their state from foreign invasion. So these black soldiers were the first black soldiers during the American Civil War. But they weren't Union soldiers, but they weren't Confederate soldiers either. They were soldiers that were raised, put in the army to defend the state of Louisiana. After the Federals captured New Orleans in April of 1862, these black soldiers, what were known as the Louisiana Native Guard, were left behind in New Orleans and they disbanded. Now, when the Federals captured New Orleans, they dissolved the Native Guard as a Louisiana militia unit. It no longer existed. But in August of 1862, the Union soldiers reestablished the Native Guard as a Union unit. And these were one of these interesting units. And this was not made up of runaway slaves. It was made up of what they called free men of color. These people had been free for generations in some cases. And not every black person in the South was a slave. And these people were, like I said, people who had been free before the war, and in some cases for many, many years. Well, when the Union Army decided they wanted to have them in their army, they became what they called the first Louisiana Native Guard. As time went on, they created more Louisiana Native Guard units. But these other units, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, were made up of runaway slaves. So they were different from the first Native Guard, who were free soldiers, what they call free men of color. Well, they were drafted into the Union Army, and they served. And in May of 1863, the Union Army came up to the little town of Port Hudson on the Mississippi River, north of Baton Rouge. There was a Confederate army there of about 6,800 men. The reason why the Federals came up here was they wanted to capture Port Hudson and gain control of the Mississippi River. When the Union soldiers came up, they also brought these black soldiers, the 1st Louisiana Native Guard and the 3rd Louisiana Native Guard. And when they made their attack, they came down from out of the north and charged down what was called the Telegraph Road. Now, they called it the Telegraph Road because it was a telegraph line that ran from the town of Port Hudson up this road to a community called Bayou Sara. Now, this map is a map of the entire battlefield, and this blue area that's squared off is the same areas that we have depicted in this diorama. This road corresponds to this road here on the diorama. This ridge of rifle pits corresponds to this ridge on the diorama. This set of earthworks where the rebels were corresponds to this line of earthworks here. This was the little town of Port Hudson. This is the little town of Port Hudson on our diorama. On the morning of May 27, 1863, the black soldiers took part in the attack on Port Hudson. Now, this was not the only attack. This was just one of a series of attacks by the Union soldiers against the rebel garrison here at Port Hudson. And the Federals attacked all up and down the line, trying to break through the earthworks to capture the town. Black soldiers took part in this assault also. And that's this area here, in this blue squared off area on the map, which corresponds, like I said, to this area here. On the morning of May 27th, they charged across 2 bridges and came down the road. Now, back in those days, when soldiers fought in the Civil War, they did not do a rush like in a mob, but they fought shoulder to shoulder, one next to each other. And this was to give them mass and to make sure they had continuity, so they could support one another. And they came down the road, charging down the road, And as they came, the Confederate heavy artillery on the riverfront was actually able to fire large cannonballs into the black Union soldiers. Also, these Union soldiers were harassed by sharpshooter fire on this detached ridge. They got to a certain point on the road when the rebel defenders here opened up with them with smaller artillery and musketry, and their attack was stopped. Now, the attack was stopped. These soldiers did not break through the rebel defenses, but there was no shame in that because all the other attacks up and down the Confederate line, the rebel line by the Union soldiers, did not break through. All the attacks failed that day, not just the Native Guard, not just the black soldiers. The significant thing was that they showed by this attack, even though it failed, that they could and would fight for their freedom and for the freedom of their other black brethren. And from this point on, more and more black soldiers were used during the Civil War, and by the time the Civil War ended, they made a very large and contribution to the Union war effort. And they said there was almost as many black soldiers in the Union Army at the end of the Civil War as there were white soldiers in the Southern Army. So they did really make a difference. They did really add to the Union strength during the Civil War. Okay. What we have here is what we call our Peace Monument. There was an investigation of the Port Hudson Town Cemetery, and during the investigation they found the remains of a Union and Confederate soldier, and it was thought it would be appropriate to rebury these two soldiers together inside the park and erect a monument, what they call a Peace Monument, dedicated to the reunification of the country and the ending of the war. And that's our monument here, just outside the back door of the museum at Port Hudson State Historic Site.
My name is Xavier Finney Law Michel. I'm going to be playing taps in honor of Andrew Caillou.